Hello, and welcome everyone. I am Rochelle Weir, and this is Phil Slade, and we are the co-founders of Decider. And Decider is all about making the world a better place through better decision making. And what you may not know is Phil's actually a behavioural economist. So who better to speak about an introduction to behavioural economics?
One would hope that I could do that.
Well, this could be awkward otherwise, right? So what are we going to cover in today's session? So here we go. Helps if I get the tech working. So we're going to have a bit of an introduction to what is behavioural economics. We're going to have a look at cognitive bias and what is that and how does it influence our decision-making skills. And we're going to then look at different ways that you can mitigate and leverage cognitive bias. So what we're going to ask you to do, if you've got questions throughout the session, please chuck them in the comments section below in LinkedIn there. And we will be monitoring that and we'll be looking to respond either in the session or we will follow up after the session. So we're going to be here for about 45 minutes. Hope you enjoy the show and let's get on with it.
Fantastic. All right. Well, we're going to do a little roll now. So look at that. We're going to roll over here. So when we start talking about behavioral economics, I always think it's interesting to understand where behavioral economics came from in order for you to understand what it is. All right. So behavioral economics is basically these two guys are the grandfathers of behavioral economics, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. And together, way back in the late 60s and early 70s, they started a series of experiments that pretty much changed the world. So Michael Lewis wrote a book called The Undoing Project. He's the guy that wrote Moneyball or The Big Short, great writer, and he did a story about these guys. Thinking Fast and Slow is the book that these guys wrote, which is considered the seminal book on behavioral economics. It's a little bit heavy, so it's not a light read. You can't sort of just bang through it in an afternoon. But if you're just sort of out the front, these are the guys that sort of started it all. But what did they start? Well, remember back in the 60s and 70s, economics was based on an idea that really came from sort of France in the 1600s, which was that we're all rational decision makers, that we're all making decisions in our best interest. We're making these cost, risk, benefit sort of decisions that for our benefit. And this kind of makes sense, right? This isn't completely untrue. Like we buy a house, and when you buy a house, you purchase something, you're more likely to look after your yard, look after the house, you're more likely to invest in family, you're more likely to want the community to be stronger because it's going to increase the value of your own home. So you're making decisions that are in your best interest, but are also in the best interest of the community. And largely our economy is based on this concept that if ownership and if we can make decisions that further our own interests and we can align the interests of ourselves as well as our communities and the government, then we'll all make better decisions together. So this is largely true. But even an early economist, Simon, started to realize that we've got this thing called bounded rationality. We've got a limited bucket of energy that it's almost like our rational brain switches off and we're no longer making great decisions. We need to have a rest. They called it bounded rationality. Our ability to think rationally has limits based on how tired we are, right? Or how much cognitively drained we are, how fatigued we are cognitively. But it's not just that we're cognitively fatigued. And this is what Amos and Daniel were looking at, because it's not just when we're tired. We actually make pretty poor decisions all the time, because if we're such rational decision makers, how could you possibly explain things like gambling, like poker machines? There's decisions that we're making all the time that have no bearing or don't actually make sense when you think about it. And you think about how we vote. You think about how we interact with our family. You think about even different things like gun control and the way that we look at, there's irrational decisions everywhere. But they started looking at gambling in particular and thought it was really interesting that if somebody had a coin and you gave someone a coin and you said, let's play a little game. Heads, I get $50 from you. Tails, you get $50 from me. And no one would pretty much take that risk, because the risk of losing $50 seemed to be more, like the pain of losing $50 seemed to be more than what you would get from winning $50. So what they found was they said, well, what about if it's you get $100 if it's tails, and I only get $50 from you if it's heads? People will take that risk all of a sudden because the pain of loss being $50 matched the pain of getting something. This is what they found. They found that they call prospect theory. You're prospecting the odds of what it would feel like. So you try the pain of losing $50 is much more than the subsequent joy or pleasure out of winning $50, right? So you're trying to avoid the loss because it's something you already have. Interestingly, they found that when you have lost something already, then this flips, and all of a sudden your risk matrix goes the other way completely. You're trying now to get back that $50. You're trying to mend the pain or soothe the pain of losing money, and so you're likely to be much more risky. And so this is illogical. It's irrational because then people lose even more money and even more money. And when we start to look at pokies, not only is it not, there's it's only 10 cents to be able to win millions of dollars. So they can see all of a sudden there's this irrational every time I'm getting closer to a win, I'm getting closer to a win, which is ridiculous. No one's getting closer to the win. Every time the odds are stacked in your favor. But to them, it feels like 50 cents for the potential of millions of dollars. But also they found that people go to the pokies, or they often gamble once they've already had a big loss, a big bill comes in, they get some bad news, they're feeling pain, or they've only got $100 left in their bank account. And rather than doing something for that, they'll go down and put it into a poker machine because maybe I'll get $50 million. So you can see how all these irrational things started to play out. But it's not that we do this, which was an interesting observation. Behavioral economics is the study of why we do this. Why is it that we have all this irrational decision making baked into our brain? And so this is what behavioral economics is. It's the study of this poor decision making matrix, or this fast decision making matrix in our brain. And once we understand that, then as we're going to see later, it's not just about avoiding pitfalls. It's also about how do you maximize this for opportunities? How do you game the system so that it works in our favor, right? So let's go back. What did they find? Well, they actually found that we don't have one rational brain like the traditional economists thought. We actually have two ways of thinking, two systems, if you like, of processing information. You've got this first system, and the brain here, you can see it's very internal. The blue dot there is your amygdala, and your amygdala puts out your fear response. It's called your fear center, but a lot of your emotions sort of are activated by this sense of survival, right? And right underneath that little blue dot is quite a long piece, and that's your hippocampus, and sort of wraps around that piece. And that hippocampus stores a lot of your long-term memories. So if you think about this is long-term memories that are unconscious and emotional reactivity that's largely unconscious as well. And those two things work together in order to make very fast decisions. And you learn things in your long-term memory and your emotions. And if things are bad in a memory, that then triggers an emotion. You can sort of see how these two things are really linked. And there's other parts of the brain in there, of course, but you kind of can see how this is an automatic system. We then have a system two, which are the faults. So these are the things that differentiate ourselves as humans. We've got these parts of the brain which allow us to think and plan ahead and look into the future. And inhibition, right? So inhibition, we've got the ability through inhibition to control the urges and impulses that are coming from our system one, right? System one is very reactive. We don't think about it. It's about conserving that energy that we've got. Remember that limited bucket of cognitive energy? We want to put as much to our system one as possible so it doesn't drain our system two. This is the benefit of experience. When you practice something, you don't have to think about it, and it's not draining you anymore. You can actually become an expert at it, and you're able to better react to a situation in the most positive way. System two is very responsive. It's new information. System one is all about instinct. It's like we've got an inbuilt machine that's built to jump to a conclusion in order to save energy. And this was Daniel Tversky's and Daniel Amos and Tversky's Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, should they? So getting name salad. this is their big thing, is that this machine to jump to conclusions is actually what we're studying. This is what this system one kind of houses our irrational decision making, because when we make those decisions, we feel good. It's emotional center of the brain. So we make a reactive decision, we feel good about it, we're more likely to do it again, even if it's not in our best interests, right? System two, the more we think about it, the more likely we are to make a better decision in our best interests, right? So this system one and how it works, it works as parts of the brain that we also see in chimpanzee. It's also in chimpanzees. It's also the part that we think develops first in the womb. We sort of see it as part of the brain stem and these sorts of elements. Chimpanzees, they're in chimpanzees, so it has an allusion to maybe it was the first part of the brain that was also developed earlier on. So we actually call this, as a bit of a shorthand, our ape, because we can never remember what system one and system two is, but you can remember your ape. And it kind of has a vernacular, that whole term of flipping out or losing your head or going ape shit is this expressions that we have, these vernacular expressions to indicate when we've lost control, all right? But system two is like the cage that we put on our system one, right? We're caging our ape. It's something that you can do consciously. So your you is like your system two. So it's like you and your ape. And it's this constant battle between you and your ape that we start to see and we start to study in behavioral economics. Now, these machine to jump to conclusions, as we see this, they're largely based on what we learn in our experiences. And when we have experiences, they're based on rules. We learn rules to navigate life, or we learn rules of thumb to better navigate rules of life. And these rules are good. Like I said, it conserves our energy, and experience would tell us that somebody who's experienced in a field, they just have trained their ape to be able to draw on those memories and that experience in a way that they know what to do. They don't have to think about it too much. It doesn't take a lot of cognitive energy, and they can then put their cognitive energy to the things that are novel or that need extra attention, right? That's what the benefit of experience is. But it doesn't always work for us. So this is me. This is me in my favorite red singlet next to my brother on his first day of school, and then me on my first day at school. And we lived in a town called Parkes, which is in central New South Wales, where the big dish is, for those of you who know where that is. And we had to cross this road that was the main road between Parkes and Orange. And it was a busy road, and we had to walk to school. But in those days, your mum didn't drive you to school if you had to cross a busy road. She just taught you how to cross the road, right? So we learnt this rule of thumb, which was look left, look right, look left again before you cross the road. Technically, it should be the other way around in Australia, but that was the song on Sesame Street at the time as well. And Mum picked up on that and said, look, get to the edge of the road, hold your brother's hand, look left, look right, look left again. And if you both agree that it's safe, then you can cross the road. It's a rule that we learn, and she did it a couple of times with us. We practiced it. So our ape learns as it learns to be safe. And then we did it ourselves. It's a great rule, kept us safe. It's a rule that kept us safe. We realized, however, after a while, that we can shorten this rule. Our brains love simplicity, right? So we realized that, I don't need to hold my brother's hand to be safe. That went out the window to start with. Then it was like, actually, we don't need to agree. We can kind of do it ourselves. And actually, we don't need to look left and right and left and right. We can actually just sort of look right. There's no cars coming. You'd step out onto the road, and as you're sort of sauntering across the road, you look left and see if there's anything coming. If there is, you stop, and that kind of works, right? It's kind of a rule that we do, and most of us do this rule. We get to the edge of the road, we look one way, we step out, start crossing the road, look the other way, and then keep crossing the road. This was a great rule. The problem is, when I was 17, I won a competition and flew to America. I thought, this is great. This is the beginning of the rest of my life. This is going to be awesome. Went through the airport, stepped out onto the road, looked right to step out on the road, and almost got taken out by a bus on my left. To this day, I can still feel the wind of the revision mirror as it swoops past my nose, right? I almost got taken out. The most amazing thing about that is my instinctive reaction was to blame the bus driver. I was like, what are you doing? You almost killed me. Now, the bus driver had a slightly different opinion on that matter. But this is what we do, right? We learn rules that keep us safe. And when we apply them in wrong contexts, not only do we often get taken out by the proverbial bus, but we also then blame the bus driver. It was them. These other people couldn't they're just idiots. They don't know what they're doing, or I can't believe that they did that, or that this happened. It must be someone else because I've done this rule for so long and it worked. The study of these rules put into different contexts under different circumstances is part of this machine of jumping to conclusions, this shortcut machine that tries to make things as short as possible, and it's what we're studying with behavioral economics. Now you might go, this all sounds great, but do I really have an 8? Do I really have a system 1 and system 2? So let's do an exercise. All right. So what I want everyone to do that's online, we can't do this live, and I'm going to roll over here. Rochelle's going to do it with us. We're going to do what's called a bit of a Stroop test. So you need to, and I really encourage you to do this because it'll give you a sense of what that automatic processing feels like. So if there's somebody around you, just warn them that you're going to be speaking out loud for a bit or things like that, right? So very simple exercise. What I want you to do is I want you to say this list from top to bottom as fast as you can. So purple, yellow, red, etc. Once I count down, and speed is of the essence here. All ready? So 3, 2, 1, go.
Purple, yellow, red, black, red, green. I think I missed one. Red, yellow, orange, blue, purple, black, red, green, orange.
Hopefully you did that faster than Rochelle, right? So if you can beat Rochelle, you're doing well. Okay. So I want you to do it again, but this time I just want you to read from the end of the list back. So orange, green, red, etc. as fast as you can, starting from orange. 3, 2, 1, go.
Orange, green, red, black, purple, blue, orange, yellow, red, green, red, black, red, yellow, purple. Yeah, a little bit harder, particularly when you get to the loss, your brain's going, okay, I'm a bit over this. All right, so last thing. Now I want you to do the same list. These are the same words, top to bottom again, like we did the first time, except this time I want you to say the color, not the word. So instead of saying purple, yellow, red, I want you to say red, blue, green. Does that make sense? So you're saying the color, not the word. Ready, set, go. Red, blue, green, yellow, green, black, blue, red, yellow, black, yellow, blue, green, red, black.
You got that. Hurrah. Hopefully you got there as well. Shell, you've done this 1,000 times, right?
And so.
1,000 times. It doesn't get any easier, really, because what's happening here is your automatic system automatically has seen the word purple and automatically wants to say purple. But your rational system, too, says, I know that that's not the rules for this one. I'm trying to inhibit that. I'm trying to cage my ape that wants to say purple and say red. And your ape goes, fine. But then you need to do it again. Yellow. Oh, wow, this is hard. You need to do it again. Red. And by the time you get sort of halfway down the list, your ape's going, okay, this sucks, right? I know it says yellow. I want to say yellow. And your bounded rationality or your cognitive energy starts to loosen a little bit. And for a lot of you didn't even get to the end of the list. I can guarantee it. Your ape just went, don't blow this. They can't even see me anyway. Why am I doing this? It just makes me feel stupid, right? But that fight, the reason that it's slower is it's the fight between your system 1 and system 2. This is a classic way of starting to look and see what that feels like when you fight. Now, this is easy when it's a Stroop test and you can look at colors. But what about when it's the difference between a rational decision and an emotional decision, say social justice, where you feel like you're owed something, or your ape's trying to kick or trying to do something and you're trying to suppress it? It can be much, much harder, or even suppress a logic. So we're going to go through all sorts of cognitive biases over the next half an hour. But I think before we get into more cognitive biases, there's one other really, really key thing that we need to learn about the way that our brain works, and this is something about speed, and we're going to do it with another exercise. So what I want you to do here, I'm going to put up a very simple question. Okay, I want you to what's the answer as quick as you can. A bat and a ball costs $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Go, answer straight away. What is it? Most people say 10 cents. Makes sense. Bat and ball costs $1.10. Bat $1 10 cents. Okay. The reality is, when you think about this more rationally, if the bat costs $1 more than the ball, then that would mean that the bat would cost $1.10, which means it would be $1.20 all up, right? So rationally, you go, okay, the ball has to cost 5 cents in order for the bat to cost $1.05, in order for the bat and the ball to cost $1.10. And sort of this makes sense.
We literally argued about this.
Yeah, literally argued about this the first time we did it. And it feels right, because the speed at which 10 cents comes to mind is so quick that your brain just goes, that's right. And you have to prove it to me that it's anything else. But the speed of the answer that comes to mind, so the faster that your system 1 or your 8 can come up with an answer, the more that your rational brain feels like it's true. It must be true because it was instant, right? And so this is really...
And you feel confident.
You feel so much confident with it, right? I usually do another thing with doors and goats, but I won't do that this time. That's hilarious fun. We'll do that another time. It does, because... again, when you can't really articulate the logic like this, sometimes it can get really maddening to be told that you're wrong. It's like, no, it's just why it's dumb. Of course it's 10 cents, right? So this is one thing to be really careful of when we're talking about cognitive bias, and that is to be wary of how quickly you come to a decision sometimes, because your first decision, your first instinct, your first impression is so strong. But also be aware that sometimes, if you're having to make decisions and you're having a fight, you will get tired eventually. Your ape is strong. It will often win in the end. Now, when we talk about different cognitive biases, as we're going to do the role, there are hundreds of cognitive biases. This is a codex that you can look at online, and it's a reasonably good way of sort of trying to identify and clump different biases in. And you go, there's no way that I can understand all of those different cognitive biases that have been studied for the last 50 years. And that's true. But what we're going to do is we're going to go through a couple of the big ones, a couple of the ones that seem to impact people's decision-making all the time. And then we're going to go through ways that you can mitigate for these biases without having to know them all. Okay, so that's what we're going to start to go through. And this is the beginning of behavioral economics. It's funny, we talk about behavioral economics and emotional intelligence are very, very closely linked, because emotional intelligence is about understanding and managing emotion, which is largely this system 1, the emotional reactivity that holds in this system 1. And the cognitive bias, or the science of behavioral economics, is understanding and managing our automatic decision-making processes, which is also our system 1, right? So they're really, really linked as concepts. One of my favorite ones, and this is a great one to as an example of how much it permeates, is this idea of anchoring. So when you go and buy a house, often what you'll find is real estate agents will try to anchor you to a high price. So often they won't say, how much is this house worth? Or how much have houses in the area sold for? They'll go, houses in the area often list for this much, because the listing price is often higher than the sale price, right? Or they'll go, oh, just up the road there was an auction and this house went for $10 million, and you go, wow, your house might be nowhere near that, but they're anchoring you to a higher value. And this idea of anchoring means that you're more likely to accept a higher value for a product. When you're going secondhand shopping, often if something's listed for $100, there's an anchor there, but I'll go in often and go, well, we were kind of hoping to get this for $30. Like, I'm anchoring the conversation straight away to a really low number. And often that's a way to bargain and to get a lower price, because you're anchoring people to a physical number. The interesting thing about this, it doesn't even need to be a number that's relevant to what you're talking about. If you go into a negotiation about the price of, say, a guitar that's maybe worth $400, a cheap guitar, and you go as a salesperson, oh, did you see that there was a marathon that was run the other day and there was 30,000 people? 30,000 people went there. That number, putting that number in that person's mind, is going to anchor them to a higher price or a higher value of a more expensive guitar. It's a really interesting anchoring as a cognitive bias. It's fascinating. But these are one of the cognitive biases that we study as behavioral economists, right? But like I said before, it's not just about avoiding pitfalls or avoiding bad decision making. You can imagine, we talked about loss aversion before, prospecting, the pain of avoiding a loss. But when you do a loss, you then get your risk matrix goes out. In organizations, we see that all the time, or sunk cost bias. This is not just about avoiding pitfalls, it's also about maximizing opportunities. And when we talk about maximizing or increasing good decision making, we often talk about it as nudging. So we're sort of nudging people towards a better decision through indirect means, through using that automatic processing to make it feel good to make a better decision. And it's not a science of 100% all the time. It's not a mandating, like masks and things like that. They were mandates. They weren't nudges. They were mandates, right? So there's a difference between mandating something and nudging someone. Nudging is a little bit more like paternal liberalism is what they call it, where we kind of feel like we're being a little bit paternalistic about things that we know what the best decision would be: eat healthier, exercise more, these sorts of things. But liberalism, so you've still got the choice. You still have to make that choice. It's just you're more likely to make a better choice. So this is nudging, and we use nudging when we try to save for money, when we try to look at our future and all sorts of things. So nudging is a really interesting concept. But nudging is, if you've heard the word nudging, is a version of behavioural economics. So this is probably the earliest form of a nudge that we can find in modern society. Because when cars were first made and they made roads to carry cars, they didn't have lines on the road. And this is a corner called Dead Man's Corner in America. And cars would fly around this corner, blind corner, and crash all the time. And the people that used to live around there, one of the houses, the families that were there, were really sick of people killing themselves right in front of their house. So what they did was they painted a line down the middle, and on one side they put an arrow to say, to nudge people towards that side of the road, and on the other side did the same. It's just a nudge, right? But then all of a sudden, immediately cars went around each other and they stopped accidents. And then from this point now, as we know, we now have lines on the road. For many parts of the world, the lines on the roads aren't law. You can still drive wherever you want. They're just nudges, They're just basically saying if you want to stay alive, this is how you navigate the road. But they're road rules, not road laws, right? So it's really interesting. I think the dangerous driving is a law in Australia, but and you could be considered to be driving dangerously. But this is the first version of a nudge. And nudges are used all the time in political campaigns. The Trump-Biden sort of election, I think, was really, really interesting because you're basically just talking to apes when you're going to a campaign. You're looking for things that confirm your views already and things that disconfirm it. And you're looking for offense, and you're trying to offend other groups, and you've got social identity and all these sorts of things. It's a treasure trove of cognitive bias and nudging that happens within in political campaigns. Advertisers know this. This is why Roger Federer is on so many ads. People like Roger Federer. Your brain goes, I like Roger Federer. I must also like this product. Well, Roger Federer is a winner, therefore this product must also be a winner. And so you do things called a halo. It's a halo effect that you halo out the feelings that you have for one thing for something else that's close by. And governments do this all the time, in terms of how to pay taxes. They do little tricks like, do you know that 60% of the people that live in your postcode pay their taxes on time? And just by saying that, you go, oh, okay, I'm more likely to go with the herd instinct, which is there's safety in numbers, there's safety in the pack, and this is a survival mechanism that goes, and governments use those sorts of things all the time. One of the greatest cognitive biases that I love is this whole idea that if it rhymes, your brain thinks that it's reason. It's because that speed thing, because if it rhymes, you can remember it quicker and it's easier, and things that are quicker and easier feel truer. And this is what happened in the O.J. Simpson case. For those of you who remember, O.J. Simpson killed his wife. Well, he was acquitted, right? And people go, how could you possibly acquit somebody that all the evidence was stacked against that O.J. Simpson killed his wife? But every day there was this piece of evidence, this crucial piece of evidence, where the killer had worn this glove and they'd got DNA in the glove. And the glove kind of didn't fit O.J. Simpson. They kind of played it up a little bit in terms of how it could fit. But the defense attorney said every day, if the glove don't fit, you must acquit. If the glove don't fit, you must acquit. Don't forget that. And every day they learnt this little rhyme. And after the post-interviews at the trial, when they said, what evidence really swayed your opinion? They said, without shadow of doubt, the biggest piece of evidence that swayed their decision making was, if the glove don't fit, you must acquit. And we see this all the time in recent floods here in southeast Queensland. If it's flooded, forget it. How many times did we hear people say that over the last because it rhymes, and therefore all of a sudden the people that would go through floods are now going, it feels like common sense to go, if it's flooded, forget it. I don't care if we could do it or not. If it's flooded, forget it. It feels true to us because we can do it. I love this. Language has got these It's rules all the time. I before E except after C. It's a rhyme. We know it. The problem is it's totally not true. I before E does not come after C, like except after C. All these other exceptions as well. But it's such a sticky rule that it feels true, except for when your foreign neighbor Keith gets 8 counterfeit beige slaves from feisty caffeinated weightlifters. I love this. I want to get this t-shirt one day, right? But that shows you that rhyme is reason. If it rhymes, incentives and nudges. It doesn't, not just financial incentives. Incentives can be non-financial as well. Status incentives, all sorts of other incentives, gamification, leaderboards, stars, badges. Michelle loves badges. They are.
I don't love badges.
But they're all incentives, right? There are different ways to incentivize things. These are nudges. And this is a big one. Working with friction. So opt in and opt out. We often hear this thing that's come into our narrative now about opting into something. So this came from a big study in European where you had to opt in for whether you were going to be a donor on your license, and their donations were really low. And then they actually made it mandatory. And so you could still choose, but you had to opt out of it. And when they had to opt out, most people didn't opt out. They just opted in, and all of a sudden, 80% of the people that had licenses had opted into to being donors for when they had accidents or died suddenly, but still had organs that they could transplant. So this is what they did, was they took the friction away from the decision. And this is about speed, right? It's about speed of decision making. An interesting thing with Dan O'Reilly used to preach this thing that was a principle called the allure of free. And the allure of free is simply that if you give someone else something for free, they're more likely to try it. So you could discount a new energy drink by 50 cents or something, and people will go, oh no, I know this other energy drink, I'll go with it. But if you say, hey, here's an energy drink for free, the allure of free goes, I got to buy one, get one free, right? It's a allure of free. And so these chemists went, great, cognitive bias, great. Behavioral economics is the new magic. We've got all of these long-term patients that are on high drugs, expensive drugs, I should say, paying high prices for these drugs, that if they only went to generic drugs, they'd be able to get their medications for cheaper, for longer. They're going to be on these medications for the rest of their life. It's going to have a major impact. So what they did was, why don't we give these generic drugs to people for free for a year? And that way they can get used to the generic drugs, and then they're more likely to buy them over the course of their life. And it didn't work. And they went, this is crap. This doesn't work. Behavioral economics is a lot of crap. And that they wrote angrily to Dan O'Reilly and said, this, your allure or free doesn't work. We offer it for free. And Dan said, well, what did you do? And so they said, well, we sent out letters to all the people that were on sort of their drugs are on sort of a subscription basis so that they get their drugs on time. And we said, if you want to opt into this scenario, would you please, just write us back, say that you want to go into the program and send it, put it in the envelope, and we'll go. And Dan said, well, that's your problem. That they've got two choices. Either I open this letter, I read this letter, I print this letter out, I choose to do something else, I then put it back in the letter, I then walk down to the post office, I then post the letter, and then I go. Or I can do nothing and just keep on what I'm doing already. I'm already budgeting for it. What am I going to do? And he said, they're obviously, the friction that you put in the system for the new thing is so high, even though it's the allure of free, they're never going to do it. Now, with medication, they said, yeah, well, we can't make it opt out. Because that's against the law. You have to opt into medication that you're doing. So Dan said, well, why don't you do something else? Why don't you say we're breaking all subscriptions and we need you to resubscribe to the program so that you send out a letter to everyone, and to get your medication, you have to fill out this letter, and then the choice just comes between, do you want the free for a year with generic drugs, or do you want the system that you were on before, but you have to indicate it, put it in. So what they've done is they haven't lowered the friction of the generic drugs. They just increased the friction of the status quo to make sure that it matched. And then all of a sudden you've got the allure of free working. Okay, and so friction, and what they found, of course, is that most people swapped, and the generic drugs worked, and all of a sudden it was tickety-boo. But that was a classic example of people making a terrible decision just because it was easier and because they couldn't be bothered thinking about it, or the resistance was too much, and so they'd rather spend a little bit more, and who cares, right? So this is classic behavioral economics. I quite like that story. But the key is, again, I can't learn, loss aversion, status quo, sunk cost bias, the backfire effect, whatever, the halo effect, all these things that you talked about are great, but I can't just keep them in my mind and learn and start to mitigate for them all the time. That is true. So we know that there are 3 things that you can do to help mitigate and leverage cognitive bias in the same instance. Okay, 3 levers that you can pull in order to do this. So one of them is to manage emotion. So for many cognitive biases, we'd see this in the trading floor. If they have just taken, when the trading floor and there's high pressure and they're trying to make investment decisions and respond and react to things, that if they just spend 5 minutes, every hour or every couple of hours doing some mindfulness or doing something that's going to manage their emotions so they're less hyperactive, then they're going to make better financial decisions and they actually make more money. So less time on the floor, but making more money. Sounds a bit counterintuitive, right? But also you can raise your emotional state. When athletes go to perform, they don't want to be thinking about it, right? They don't want their rational brain. They've trained their automatic ape to be able to play. Once they start thinking about it, they actually start making mistakes. They're better when they're not thinking about it. So what do? They raise their emotion. You see tennis players with music on, or basketball players, they're actually trying to raise their emotion. They go onto the field trying to be hyped up because they're trying not to think. They're actually trying. They play better, they perform better in their emotion. So emotion is a leverage, but not all biases are mitigated and leveraged by emotion, right? One of the ways that we've got, and we can look at emotional intelligence, obviously, is a big part of this lever. And you can have a look at this emotion wheel and look at intensity of emotion. We talk about dialing it up and dialing it back. And so how can you dial up and dial back sadness, and there's a beginning of empathy and all sorts of things. But have a look into the emotional intelligence stuff there. That's a big field of study, but massively will improve your decision making if you can better understand and manage your emotions, right? But the second one is just increase awareness. So sometimes in my situation, in my job, or in my context, whether it be at home, whether it be the family. So say loss aversion, if you're in the board and making constant decisions about investment and strategy, loss aversion, satisfied bias, and sunk cost bias, those 3 biases are going to be present every single day of your life. And so you need to learn about them and become aware of them so that you can consciously mitigate for them. You can't do it for everything, but it does work. And so that's when you learn a little bit more about increasing awareness for cognitive bias. Unfortunately, we have a little cheat sheet that we're going to send out to you. I think we're going to post it now in the chat, in the LinkedIn chat, as well as in many different ways. So hopefully you get this little resource that looks at very common biases and what they are, and it's kind of a little guide for you to go a little bit deeper with some of the things that we've looked at today. Reimer's reasons on this, loss aversions on here, and confirmation biases on here. Bizarreness effect is on here as well. So you can have a look at this and use this as a guide to study further. But also you can, in the future, we're doing more webinars about different biases and you can sign up for them. The third thing you can do is to design your environment. All right, so designing your environment is like anchoring. Anchoring, you can be aware of it, but you still can't mitigate for it. And the experiments with anchoring, even if they know that you're doing it with prices or with, real estate agents, it's very hard to mitigate it, even if you're consciously aware that it's happening. It's such a strong bias. So the idea would be to design an environment which makes you less prone to that sort of bias. So information is the key. This is realestate.com and all of these real estate sites which show you what prices are actually being sold in the area and what this price was sold before. You arm yourself against anchoring, for instance, by designing your choice environment to better serve you. A good way I try to explain this is about dieting. Dieting, if you're trying to not eat sugary foods or fatty foods, don't have it in your fridge. Design your environment so that you're not even tempted by it. So you don't have to make a decision, right? If you're in an office where you're needing to have collaboration, set up the office or your online environment so you can naturally collaborate. So the resistance to collaborating is lower than the resistance just doing it by myself, because it's easy for me just to do it and I don't need to collaborate and it gets done, etc. if that's important. So you've got to think about how you design your environment to set yourself up for success. I think this whole designing of an environment becomes really important when we start looking at the new way of working. and how we set ourselves up. Because sometimes it's really easy for us to just work from home. A lot of us love working from home. A lot of us that are in a portfolio of work and a portfolio of clients love, like, it makes it much easier for us to manage work at home. But that ease may not actually be doing us the greatest service, or maybe it is. Just starting something we did pre-pandemic isn't all great. But you go, we've got a great opportunity to go, how do we actually set up the environment, our work environment, our home environment, in order to set ourselves up for success, to make the best decisions possible, irrespective of what this sort of reactive nature wants to do. Because the reactive nature has gotten used to working from home now. It's inconvenient, kind of kick when we have to be sitting in traffic and things like that. So this is a cognitive bias that's working in action at the moment. So nudge theory and cognitive bias, these are some great books that you can take away to deep dive even further. What we've done is just given you a taste of behavioral economics here at the moment. These books are great. So Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow up the top there, that's a heavy book. Nudge is pretty heavy as well. But these, and The Ethics of Influence, they're pretty heavy. But these are sort of some of the seminal books. So Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein wrote Nudge. Richard Thaler also did Misbehaving. It's a sort of a follow-up to the book Nudge, which I find good. Cass Sunstein there looks at the ethics of influence. So this is, if you're thinking about what's the line between when it becomes unethical to be leveraging or playing with these cognitive biases to the extent that we're taking away free choice. It's a fascinating concept, and it's this idea of paternal liberalism. Cass Sunstein, who co-wrote Nudge, also writes it in The Ethics of Influence. Bottom left-hand side, that's Malcolm Gladwell, who's a great storyteller. He's not a scientist. He's a journalist who writes about science. He has a great podcast as well, but he writes these books, and Blink is one of the books that really does look at this automatic processing. What are the choices you make in the blink of an eye, and the conclusions that you jump to? And he looks at and explores the idea of expertise. But it's a fun read. It's a much easier read, as is Michael Lewis's The Undoing Project, which will get you into some of the mindsets in an easier sort of way. Obviously, my book there, Going Apeshit, that we published, is also an easy read, but will take you through not just cognitive bias, but also begin to look at the broader influence of emotional reactivity on decision making, and put some more practical life-bound stories around to give you a better explanation of how I've personally started to unpick my own life in terms of cognitive bias. I came to psychology when I was about sort of 30. I was in theatre, I was in the arts. I saw a lot of influence. I was in politics. All sorts of parts of experience came together with the writing of these books. So these are great books to go a little bit deeper and understand a little bit more about cognitive bias. You can also email us or follow us on the web, or give us a shout out.
Absolutely. So we hope that you've enjoyed the session, and I hope you can see the links to some of the different handouts and artifacts that we talked about in the session today. But we also just wanted to give a bit of a plug to the next event. So we're doing a monthly webinar series on all sorts of different conversations that we want to have, that we believe will help make the better world a better place through better decision making. And next month is all about social intelligence. So it's about understanding not just about your own emotional reactivity, but being able to sense and empathize and understand what's happening in the world around you, and adjust the way that you interact with others appropriately to respond for maximum influence and impact. So we'll chuck a link to the website there, so you've got the details for all of those as well. We also have all of these sessions are recorded, so they'll be available on our YouTube channel. So feel free to subscribe, and you can play them back at your convenience.
I should also mention that on the bottom of this slide here, you'll see something called Switch for Schools. If you're a teacher or you're in education, that's something where we're applying some of this cognitive bias and emotional intelligence in practical ways into classrooms to help kids become better decision makers intuitively. It's to take the resistance out of becoming better decision makers. And so if you're interested in that, go to Switch for Schools, and you can check out what we're doing there. We're pretty excited about that as a thing. So it all links together.
Thank you so much for dialing in. We were glad you're here, and we hope to see you at the next session.
Ciao.